The separation of church and state. What's the real history behind that? What was meant by it? What is meant by it? How has it been interpreted? Obviously, in today's more secular culture, it seems by some to be interpreted to mean that there should be no interplay, interaction, no contact between faith and the state. Well, what's the reality behind it? What, in fact, when our founders drafted and crafted the documents that served as the foundation of this country, what did they intend? Well, if you've been following along, certainly based on the documents and inscriptions that we looked at, the state constitutions, the federal constitution, the Declaration of Independence, it certainly doesn't seem on the surface, at least, that there was any intention whatsoever by the founders of this country that there would be this drastic separation between faith in America and the state, the government, so to speak. Anyway, I want to look at the separation of church and state and the issues revolving around it, a little bit of the history and so forth. So let's take a look at the separation of church and state. So the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says this, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Specific to our topic here, obviously, it's the first phrase or sentence. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So the words church, state, nor separation appeared in that First Amendment. None of those three words appear. The prohibition against establishment of a religion in the First Amendment is addressed exclusively to Congress. Notice it says Congress shall make no law. This is the United States Congress. So the First Amendment merely states that the Congress of the United States cannot make a law that establishes a religion, a state religion. Again, understanding where the colonists came from. They came from situations predominantly at the time in Europe where the countries had a state religion. And basically all other denominations or sects or religions or whatever were either frowned upon, persecuted, etc. The original intent of the founders was to preclude the domination of a particular denomination or sect of the Christian faith. Again, if you've been following along in the previous lessons, certainly there was no notion of precluding Christian faith or even Christian faith being a requirement for office holders, for example, and so forth. The idea was obviously to see that there wasn't a state religion founded in the United States of America, a national church, so to speak. That forbidding of the establishment of a national denomination has now been interpreted by many judges to mean a prohibition of public religious activity that has any contact with the state is basically ridiculous. And yet that is what the interpretation of the phrase separation of church and state has been in the past several decades. And we're going to get into where that actually came from. The reality is our heritage is Christian, and any unbiased study of our founding documents and leaders will lead you to that conclusion. I hope you've seen that already in the things that we've looked at. Again, the prohibition applies specifically and only to Congress. The Constitution nor the Bill of Rights precludes any other public or private institution from establishing religious standards, etc. It does not apply to the states or to localities. Indeed, as we saw, the state constitutions at the time that the federal constitution was written already had many um, prerequisites and requirements, qualifications for office holders, governors, etc., had to be professing Christians. Certainly, there was no notion that there should be this separation of church and state in the states. That's for sure. The Constitution nor the Bill of Rights would offer any support to a position that there is a right of someone to be free from religion or any exposure to it. In other words, this idea that faith of any kind, the Christian faith or any other for that matter, that no one should have to be exposed to it, hear about it, presented by it, surrounded by it, whatever, have any contact with religious faith is kind of ridiculous, really. Although some try to stretch this notion of separation of church and state to mean that there should be no expression of faith, and in this case, Christian faith, in the public square. This is particularly true in the states, the local jurisdictions, and especially private institutions. Again, the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause applies to Congress only. And in fact, it not only it does preclude the Congress of the United States from establishing a religion, but it also specifically says that it shouldn't do anything to interfere or prohibit the free exercise thereof. What does that mean? That means it should not be stuffed into a closet. It doesn't mean that once we leave our houses and homes that we have to leave our faith behind. Nothing in really any of this would preclude Christmas parties in schools or the Ten Commandments posted in a school or a courthouse. Again, the First Amendment merely says that the Congress of the United States cannot establish basically a national church, a national faith, if you will. It doesn't preclude a school from having a Christmas pageant, a Christmas concert. It doesn't preclude a school or any institution in the country from posting the Ten Commandments. Ironically, of course, there's a relief, I think it is, of Moses holding the Ten Commandments in the Supreme Court. Again, the preclusion in the First Amendment is specifically that Congress cannot make a law which establishes a state religion or a single denomination as the official church of the land. For almost 200 years, we had prayer, Bible study, and other religious activities in the schools. If you watched my last lesson, my last video, went through all the different ways in which the Christian faith was really the foundation of education in this country at the very, very beginning. It was in the middle of the 20th century that judges began to find those things outlawed in the First Amendment somehow. So, how should one interpret the Constitution? Here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson. On every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. So, in other words, what Thomas Jefferson was saying is, if we're going to interpret the Constitution properly, go back and as best we can uh, enter into the mindset of the founders, of the authors of the Constitution, of the Declaration, etc., of all the founding documents, and take that context and interpret it in that context. Well, what we've seen already is the context was deeply, deeply rooted in Christian faith. James Wilson, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, said the first and governing maxim in the interpretation of a statute, and in this case, the Constitution, is to discover the meaning of those who made it. So, in other words, if we are to have this strict separation, no contact between faith and the state, that if the expression of Christianity is to be scrubbed from the public square, and anybody who has deeply held Christian faith is to be excluded from office or excluded from being a judge on any court, let alone the Supreme Court, as we've seen in some of the hearings where people who express a deep faith are lambasted and are scorned and basically described as being unfit, when in fact the original intent of the documents, as we've seen particularly at the state level, was just the opposite. You had to be a professing Christian in order to be qualified for office. So we have gone 180 degrees. Judge Joseph Story, who was a Supreme Court justice in the 1800s, said, the real object of the First Amendment was not to countenance, much less to advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects or denominations, and to prevent any national and ecclesiastical establishment which would give to an hierarchy the exclusive patronage of the national government. In other words, the idea of the First Amendment was to prevent or preclude the national government, in this case the Congress, from establishing a particular denomination as the national church, which is what they had fled from. The Anglican Church, for example, the Church of England. They did not want that happening in the United States. The different colonies, different states, basically had different Protestant denominations predominantly, which were the most popular ones in the different states. And even my understanding is that some of the states had even established state churches in their state. Without precluding the free exercise of other denominations in the state. But the idea was was not to be a national church established by Congress. 1985, Judge Rehnquist, the framers intended the Establishment Clause to prohibit the designation of any church as a national one. The clause was also designed to stop the federal government from asserting a preference for one religious denomination or sect over others. I think that's consistent. So if the framers had intended to establish a real wall of separation between the government and religion, why on the same day the First Amendment was passed did Congress call on President Washington to proclaim a national day of prayer and thanksgiving? Clearly, if their intent was to create this impenetrable wall between the church and the state, why would they call on the leader of the state, President Washington, to declare, proclaim, and establish a day of prayer, obviously a Christian prayer and thanksgiving? The proclamation uses clear religious language, acknowledging they would not even have a government without God's blessing. The proclamation that's being referred to is the one that George Washington drafted and distributed, establishing again a national prayer, National Day of Prayer and Thanksgiving. So, where did this notion of the separation of church and state come from? Well, it came from actually, it's as I said, it's not in the Constitution. Where did it come from? It came from a letter that Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, uh, and actually, the interesting thing is Thomas Jefferson wasn't even in the United States when the Constitution was written and had no participation in the writing of the First Amendment. But he's the one that uses this phrase, the separation of church and state. Now, Thomas Jefferson obviously was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. And obviously, the Declaration of Independence refers very specifically to our rights coming from our Creator, capital C. So Jefferson, he's president now in 1802, and he writes a letter on January 1st to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut. They had written to him expressing their concerns that in Connecticut there was a particular denomination that was being favored. I believe it was the Congregationalists, and it was being favored by the state. And their fear was, of course, that Connecticut would establish this state church and that everybody else would have to line up behind them. And further, that perhaps even worse in their view, that the federal government would establish some other denomination other than theirs as the national church. And Thomas Jefferson writes back assuring them that that wasn't going to happen. Now, Jefferson didn't intend that there would be a divorce of religion and the government, but to assure them that the government should not be in a position of establishing, again, a state church, and that religious institutions should be protected from any political or governmental control. In other words, it was to protect the church from the state, not to protect the state from the influence of the church. Okay? It was to protect the church from anything influencing them from the state. So the state can't tell them what they are to do and not to do. It was not to stop the church from obviously ministering, if you will, to the state. Indeed, if Jefferson had intended a secular government free from the influence of religion, then why did he, number one, include prayer at both of his inaugurals, both of his, when he was elected, both times, there was prayer. He signed bills appropriating money for chaplains in Congress and the military. He also earnestly recommended the members attend worship services. Why would he recommend to the members of Congress that they go to church if he intended there to be this impenetrable wall between church and state? Because he thought that the influence of churchmen on the government was a positive thing, whereas the influence of the state on the churches was a negative thing. Jefferson signed bills to pay for a church and priests for the Indians, missionaries. He advocated tax-supported missions to the Indians to include instruction in the principles of Christianity specifically. Now, I want to share with you a video that's kind of going to summarize some of this, and then I will summarize myself at the end.
Almost everyone has heard of the doctrine of the separation of church and state. Most Americans believe that it's in the United States Constitution. But there is no such phrase in the Constitution, and there never was, for a simple reason. The Founding Fathers never intended for church and state to be completely separate. They saw religion, specifically religions based on the Bible, as indispensable to the moral foundation of the nation they were creating. So where does that phrase come from? It comes from one brief letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802. At the end of a very long sentence in which Jefferson affirms his conviction that religious belief should be a private matter and that the government should not interfere with such matters, he uses the phrase, building a wall of separation between church and state. And that's where the phrase lived, undisturbed, lost in Jefferson's voluminous correspondence for almost 150 years. But more on that in a moment. First, let's discuss what the Constitution actually does say about religion and its role in public life. The answer is found in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's plain what those words mean. The federal government could not establish a national religion, the common practice in Europe. The United States was going to be different. Americans would be free to follow the religion of their choice. When James Madison first proposed what eventually became the First Amendment, his original wording was that no religion shall be established by Congress. But that language was later modified after it was pointed out that this might be taken to mean that the government, including the state governments, had no interest in religion at all. The founders did not want this. As George Washington said in his farewell address, religion and morality are indispensable supports of our political prosperity. Washington's view remained the nation's view throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. But that changed in 1947. In that year, in the case of Everson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that under the First Amendment, neither a state nor the federal government could pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. For the first time in American history, the First Amendment was not only about the prohibition of establishing a national religion, it was also about not giving any encouragement to any religion. The modern strict separation view was born. And where did the 5 justices look for support for their argument? Not the Constitution, because there was nothing in the Constitution to help them, but to that one phrase Thomas Jefferson wrote back in 1802. How ironic that the author of the Declaration of Independence, which recognizes the proposition that human beings have inalienable rights from their Creator and not from government, was now being used to separate religion from the public square. For Jefferson and the other founders, religion was central to the entire American project. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are just 2 of countless examples where the government acknowledges its debt to God. As the famously liberal Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas wrote in the case of Zorak versus Clausen just 5 years after the Everson decision, we are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being. The founders would certainly have agreed. Following Everson, the nation's moral infrastructure began to crack, at first slowly and then more rapidly. In 1962, the Supreme Court struck another blow. It ruled in Engel versus Vitale that a generic school prayer violated the court's new definition of the First Amendment. Listen to the words of that school prayer. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen. The prayer was not specific to Christianity or to any religion. Since then, the separation of church and state metaphor has been used to remove God and religion piece by piece from American public life. Are we a better society for it? It's hard to argue that we are. Almost every cultural and ethical indicator, marriage rates, birth rates, the number of Americans giving to charity, has declined since God and religion have faded from American life. Meanwhile, children without fathers in their lives, behavioral problems in schools, and crime have gone up dramatically, and all because of one vote in one court case based on one sentence in one letter. On such things do nations and history turn. I'm John Eastman, professor of law at Chapman University and a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute.
I hope this has been convincing to you, particularly when you look at what we've already gone over in the previous lessons, that the intent of our founding fathers, our founding documents, and so forth was never that there would be this strict separation between church and state. The idea of establishing the United States of America, the reason that so many of the colonists had come to America was to flee uh, for uh, uh, for the freedom of the expression of their faith, and to get away from the notion that the state would establish a particular denomination, a particular religion, and require it of everyone. They were fleeing from that. And so their fear was making sure that that did not happen here. And so that's what this separation idea was all about, that the state would not establish, the federal government would not establish a national church. They wouldn't pick one of the denominations. But there was such an infusion of Christianity in the nation, as is evident by obviously the state constitutions and the writings of the founding fathers and so forth. There was never a notion that Christianity in particular should be scrubbed from the public square, or that professions of faith should be kept in a closet. Indeed, as I said, the primary thing, the primary mechanism here was to keep the government from influencing the church, from dictating to the church. It was not, obviously, to keep the church from ministering, uh, from uh, from influencing the government. In fact, obviously, over and over in their writings and their expressions of their own faith, they said basically that this particular constitution that they were written was written for a religious and moral people. And obviously the self-control and self-restraint that comes with people of who are devoutly religious, particularly in Christianity, is necessary in order for this Constitution to work. Without the restraints, the self-restraints of the populace, the government has to become more and more strict in terms of its laws, its regulation, its policing, and so forth. So the farther that we drift away from our moorings, our Christian moorings and our Christian foundation, the more we risk the yielding of our liberties as the state has to control and protect against chaos if the people will not exercise the self-control that is evident in those who are devoutly religious, and in our nation's founding, in particular, the Christian faith. I hope this has been educational. Hope that gives you a better understanding of what the idea, the notion, the intentions of church and state were from the founding, and what they rightly should be today. Christians should not be bowing out political involvement. We should not avoid voting, for example. We should be expressing ourselves not only in the voting booth, but also in the public square. We should not be shy about it. Our founders weren't, and neither should we. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you'll look for the next lesson. God bless you.